Lloyd, Mr. Medwick wants to see you.
Me?
Lloyd, come in. Sit down. I'm afraid we've got some bad news for you, Lloyd. We're going to have to let you go. Now, let me explain why. Now, Lloyd, when you first came to us, there was no question in my mind that you were able to do the work assigned. At the same time, I was a little worried because you never seemed to be able to get it without question.
Lloyd Bornman doesn't have what it takes to fit in here. What does it take to fit in? Well, for most companies, there are certain basic principles you can follow or not follow. Let's consider Lloyd's case. We'll go back to the day Lloyd was hired. As part of the usual orientation, company policies were carefully explained to Lloyd by the personnel director.
The hours here are from 8:30 to 5, with 45 minutes for lunch. Oh, there are 2 15-minute coffee breaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Now, you're allowed 1 sick day per month. And if you can't come in, be sure to call Mr. Medwick.
Useful information intended to help Lloyd get along on the job. But he didn't think it was important.
Now about your pay. We pay twice a month, on the 1st and the 15th. Now, when you get your check, you'll notice that there are some deductions we take out for Social Security and withholding taxes. And also
Lloyd's mind was 100 miles away.
Your hospitalization is paid for by the company. Here's the employee's handbook. It goes into detail on everything that I've mentioned.
The man tried to do everything possible to help Lloyd get started. But by the time Lloyd got home, he'd forgotten most of what he'd heard. And he didn't even bother to look at his employee handbook, much less read it. He left it with some other papers, which were eventually thrown out. Lloyd started his first day on the job not knowing the rules and policies of his company. He was in trouble almost from the moment he arrived, 10 minutes late.
I was wondering if you were going to show up.
Well, I missed my bus.
Well, let's get started. I want you to meet Jack Martz. Jack, this is Lloyd Borman.
Glad to know you, Lloyd.
I'd like you to introduce him to Ken and Larry and the others.
Be glad to.
Now, be sure he understands what everybody does, so he knows who to see for what.
I understand. Gene, pardon me just a minute, but I'd like you to meet Lloyd Bornman. Lloyd, this is Jean Martin, our secretary, and well, she takes care of our correspondence. This is Ken Kiefer. Now, you can find your plans for, well, every product that we've ever made. Larry Cox. Now, if you need paper, ink, or a new pen, or maybe even a T-square, well, Larry's the man to see. Paul Sutz, our product manager. Now, most of our work comes from Paul. His designers get the ideas, and we draw them.
Again, Lloyd didn't really listen. He didn't listen to the names of the other workers or to what they did. It didn't occur to him that he'd be depending on them later to get his job done.
Now, I want you to go through each one of these drawings.
Later, Mr. Medwick gave Lloyd his first assignment. He explained carefully how he wanted the drawings done.
Be sure to make up a separate specification for each item. Don't put it on the individual drawing because there isn't room. You'll just be wasting your time. Now, I want simple orthographic views, front, top, and side. And if you run across a part that you think needs an oblique projection, will you check with me before you
Was Lloyd understanding directions? It was hard to tell. So Mr. Medwick asked him,
Do you understand? You're sure? Well, good. You can get started.
But when Lloyd got to work, he began to realize how much he needed the information he'd received and forgotten.
Say, where can I get a beam compass? What's that guy's name in production? Who can give me the dimensions in this part? Where's the title supposed to go? Where do I find the specs on this?
The other workers didn't mind his questions at first. But after he'd asked the same question for the third or fourth time, once Lloyd had the answers, he was slow in getting started. He kept finding other things to do. Personal phone calls, trips to the water cooler. He took more time than he was allowed for coffee breaks and for lunch. Finally, he got to work and finished a drawing.
But now this is pretty bad. Look at the smears you've got in here. And when you mark a center line, I expect it to be center. Look, you're off center on both of these down here. Now look at this lettering here. In the first place, you've written out every word. They should be...
Mr. Medwick tried to point out what was wrong in a helpful way.
Now, in addition to all these other things, Lloyd, you've got a wholly unnecessary view here.
It's not my fault. Jack told me to do it that way.
As the days went on, instead of learning from his mistakes, Lloyd made new ones. Rather than wait to punch out, he decided to skip it. If he had bothered to read his employee's handbook, he would have learned that a time card is needed as a legal record of a worker's hours.
Lloyd, I think you understand why it is that we're letting you go. I mean, it isn't anything that has been so bad that it's any...
Increasingly, Lloyd spent his time blaming other employees and the company for his mistakes, rather than learning from them.
That's about it. Goodbye, Lloyd. Better luck on your next job. Well, hello, Stan.
In getting a replacement for Lloyd, Mr. Medwick hired Stanley Edwards, a man who seemed almost an opposite of Lloyd.
Just tell me a little bit about your background.
I got all A's in my drafting classes. I think I could do a good job.
Stan was alert, bright, and eager. He seemed to be an excellent prospect. When Stan talked to the personnel director, he paid close attention and asked questions. Perhaps too many questions.
Instead of twice a month, why don't you pay every other week? Then we get our checks always on the same day. It'd be easier to budget.
No, that's true. But our accounting department closes their books at the end of each month. If the pay period closes at the same time, it saves them lots of time and work. Now, if the pay period overlaps, then our accountants
Responding to Stan's questions took a great deal of the director's time, but he didn't mind. He was pleased to find someone who seemed interested in the company. Stan took the employee's handbook home and began to read. A good start, until he came across some rules that didn't make sense to him. He didn't waste time trying to understand them. His mind leaped ahead to ways of changing the rules and to ways of getting around the rules to suit himself. Stan was eager, all right, eager to please himself, but not to fit in. Arriving early on the job the first day, Stan still looked promising to Mr. Medwick. His fellow employees were the first to suspect that something might be wrong.
This is Stan Edwards.
Ken Kiefer?
That's right, Kiefer.
Glad to meet you, Ken. Have you been at this job long?
About 8 years, Stan.
Have you ever thought of using micro? You know, I saw a system that, at Acme Engineering, that took up about 1/10 of the space, and yet it was...
Instead of simply learning each man's name and what his job was, Stan began giving advice. Maybe later, after he had proved himself, some of his suggestions might have been welcome. But now, he was just a new employee who should have been trying to fit in. Mr. Medwick began to realize that Stan might not be right for the job when he started explaining to him how he wanted the work done. Stan interrupted several times with suggestions for improved ways of doing it before his boss had a chance to finish. Mr. Medwick had to interrupt Stan to explain why he wanted it done a certain way. He didn't want to discourage him from making improvements, but there were reasons for doing it the way it was done, and Mr. Medwick went over them in detail. Finally, after the long explanation, Stan seemed to understand. Without any further delays, he got busy and started to draw. But Stan's first drawing showed he'd never really listened. He'd put in views not called for, and he'd changed the format of the plate. When Mr. Medwick tried to explain again why he didn't want it done that way, Stan argued with him, insisting that his way was better. Again, Mr. Medwick went through a long explanation, which took time and cost the company money. In the days that followed, Stan continued trying to change the way things were done. He didn't seem to care if anyone wanted his advice or not.
You notice that the CBSR series is more efficient, less heat buildup, and also puts out more tracings per hour. But the...
Stan, Mr. Medwick would like to see you in his office.
Mr. Medwick hired Stan to make drawings, not to reorganize his department. But Stan couldn't seem to follow the routines of the company. He wasn't able to fit in. So Stan was also let go. This time, imagine that you're being hired. By now, you've probably got an idea of things a new employee can do to fit in. Would you do better than Lloyd or Stan? Would you make an effort to learn and remember the rules and regulations of your company? Or would you be a Lloyd? Or a Stan? Would you read through an employee's handbook and try to understand company policies? Or would you use your time trying to think of ways to change things? Or would you disregard it altogether? When introduced to your fellow employees, would you forget their names or not even hear them as Lloyd did? Would you take up more of their time than necessary, as Stan did? How would you respond? In hearing about how your job is to be done, would you be thinking about how you would do it? Or not really listening? Do you think you would do better? After receiving your instructions, would you delay getting at your work? Or give advice to others on how to do their work? If you dug right in, would you do it your own way or the way your company wants it done? Having done your best, what would you do if your boss pointed out mistakes? Give him an argument, an alibi? Or would you listen carefully to be sure you understood what you did wrong so you wouldn't make the same mistakes again? How would you do? Would you be like Lloyd and do too little? Would you be like Stan and try to do too much? How would you fit in?